Dr. Malcolm Ellis, a successful black surgeon and CEO in the predominantly white town of Elmsford, faces systemic racism and corruption when he uncovers a cover-up involving police brutality. Despite his accomplishments, he's repeatedly undermined and disrespected by figures like Officer Daniels, who belittles him due to his race. As Malcolm battles against the entrenched biases and prejudice within both the police and the town's leadership, he risks everything to expose the truth, facing threats, attempts to silence him, and personal attacks, all while fighting a system designed to keep him, and others like him, subjugated. Dr. Malcolm Ellis was used to the looks he had learned to read, the subtle flicker of recognition, followed by that pause, a brief hesitation, like people were trying to place him, to decide whether they should acknowledge the quiet power radiating from him or pretend it wasn't there. He had seen it all before. The curious stares from strangers as he passed, the whispering among those who thought he couldn't hear them, the microaggressions that slid in with a smile. But here, in the small diner on Elmsford's main street, he was just another man waiting for his coffee. The waitress, older than him by a decade at least, wore a tired but kind smile. Her name tag read Carla, and her thick curly hair was pulled back in a bun that looked like it had been carefully crafted a few hours ago, but now sat in a state of casual disarray. She moved swiftly between tables, filling cups and delivering plates with practiced ease, but her eyes kept coming back to him, as if she was trying to convince herself she hadn't seen what she thought she saw. Dr. Malcolm Ellis, surgeon and CEO of Elmsford Medical Center, sitting in the corner booth of a greasy spoon diner, where the best thing on the menu was a bacon cheeseburger. It was his first day off in months. No surgeries, no board meetings, no demands from the hospital administration. He had slipped on his faded jeans, a simple t-shirt, and sneakers, and taken a break from his usual schedule. Too exhausted from the constant pressure of being one of the few black men at the top of his field in a town where even the most progressive among them struggled with his presence. He could feel the weight of the quiet judgment in the air. But here, in this diner, he was Malcolm Ellis, a man with no title, no status, no badge, just a person enjoying a rare moment of peace. As Carla approached his table, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second, like she wasn't sure whether to speak first or pretend that this wasn't the man she knew from every hospital report, every news article, every local headline. She placed the coffee in front of him with a soft clink and gave him a warm smile, a little too bright. "You're Dr. Ellis, right?" she asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't asking so much as confirming. Malcolm looked up from his menu, raising an eyebrow as he met her eyes. "I am, but you can just call me Malcolm." His voice was steady, calm. He wasn't in a rush. Not today. "Oh, sure," she said, a little flustered. "Sorry, I just wanted to make sure." She wiped her hands on her apron, still standing a little too stiffly, like she wasn't sure whether she should leave or stay. You don't look like you're supposed to be here." Malcolm chuckled, the sound low and self-deprecating. "What do you mean?" He let the question hang in the air as he glanced around the diner. It was small and familiar, with vinyl booths that creaked with every shift, and the sweet scent of old coffee and grilled food clinging to the air. The faded posters on the walls advertised local events, high school football games, and community fairs. Nothing that screamed high society. It was a place where people came to unwind after a long day or just to grab a quick bite. He could see that Carla was still waiting for him to give some kind of answer. The moment hung, suspended in awkward silence. "Well, no offense, but, I mean, you're the big surgeon, right?" She faltered, biting her lip. "I just don't think I've seen you here before." "Maybe I've never been here before," Malcolm replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I thought I'd try something different for a change." He didn't add that he came here because it was the one place in town where he could sit without being constantly recognized. He didn't want to be the town's celebrity doctor or a living headline. Not today. Carla nodded, though her smile was tight, like she still wasn't sure if this whole situation made sense. "Well, I'm glad you're here. If you need anything, just let me know." As she turned to walk away, Malcolm sipped his coffee, the bitterness warming his chest. This wasn't the first time his wealth and status had caused discomfort in places where he was trying to be just a man. In Elmsford, people had their ways. He'd heard it all. The murmurs, the whispers in hushed tones, the assumptions made because of his appearance. His success was something they all acknowledged, but it was something they never quite knew how to accept. Outside, the world was bustling on this mid-afternoon. The sun cast a golden light over the streets, shining off the old brick buildings. But there was something about the air that felt heavy with unspoken tension. Elmsford was a town with old money, but not always open arms. It was a place where people got by on tradition and familiarity. The powerful and the privileged held sway. But Malcolm had spent years in this town, slowly carving out his place in the system. That meant he knew how the game was played, even if it wasn't always fair. The door of the diner swung open, and a gust of cool wind sent a few stray papers fluttering to the floor. A man walked in, dressed in a worn leather jacket and a pair of jeans that hadn't seen a tailor in years. His face was familiar, but only in a way that made Malcolm hesitate before fully placing it. It was Greg Hayes, a city councilman with a reputation for pushing through the kind of projects that were supposed to revitalize Elmsford, but often felt more like gentrification. With a coat of fresh paint, Malcolm had crossed paths with Hayes on several occasions, but their interactions were always cordial, nothing more. He didn't care much for the man's policies, which always seemed to benefit the wealthy in town, while neglecting the marginalized communities Malcolm worked tirelessly to support. Hayes walked past Malcolm's booth with a slight nod of recognition, his eyes never quite meeting his. He glanced at the menu, as though pretending not to notice the black man sitting in the corner. Malcolm's grip tightened around his cup. It was moments like this, subtle moments, that always gnawed at him. He'd built his career from the ground up. He had fought, scraped, and earned his place as one of the few black surgeons at the top of his field in this town. But in places like this diner, in the shadow of a man like Greg Hayes, it all seemed so fragile. As much as he had achieved, he was still a stranger in a world that never truly accepted him. The waitress, Carla, came back to his table a few minutes later, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Sorry about that," she said. "I didn't mean to make things awkward. Sometimes people, well, they just stare a little when they see someone like you here." Malcolm gave a half smile. "No harm done," he said. "I'm just like everyone else after all." Carla didn't seem convinced, but she turned to leave, still unsure about how to navigate the situation. As she walked away, Malcolm leaned back in his booth, his gaze flickering toward the window. The town was quiet, but he could feel the underlying tension of it all. He was at the top now, but there was always a sense of unease, an invisible line he had to constantly cross, a reminder that no matter how much he had achieved, people would always find ways to remind him where he belonged. As if on cue, the front door opened again, and a figure stepped in, casting a shadow that was impossible to ignore. Officer Daniels. He was tall, his uniform crisp, but his expression carried something darker, something unfriendly. He paused by the door for a moment, scanning the room, and when his eyes found Malcolm's, the tension in the room shifted. There it was again, the unspoken understanding. Malcolm's eyes narrowed, and he stood, slipping his hands into his pockets. His day off was already starting to feel more like a battlefield than a break. Malcolm Ellis watched as Officer Daniels sauntered toward him, each step measured with purpose. The man's uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, but there was an undeniable chill in the air as he neared. Daniels was one of those people Malcolm had learned to read over the years, calculated, with a clear agenda in mind, yet skilled enough to mask his intentions behind a professional facade. It was as if the air shifted, thickened, when Daniels' eyes locked onto his. A flicker of recognition flashed across the officer's face. Then, a brief glance to the left, a quick nod, before he slowly made his way toward the counter. His presence didn't sit well with Malcolm. Not today. Not in this diner, where he had hoped to escape the quiet hostility of Elmsford's daily undercurrents. But here he was, yet another reminder that Malcolm Ellis could never truly escape his identity. Daniels reached the counter and greeted Carla with a few casual words. She gave a polite nod, but it was clear that her attention was still on Malcolm. There was no need to make eye contact, it was understood. The officer's deliberate avoidance of Malcolm's gaze felt almost rehearsed, as though he had long ago determined where someone like him belonged, and where he didn't. Malcolm didn't move. He kept his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, the ceramic warm against his fingers. the hot liquid soothing the simmering frustration beneath his calm exterior. A part of him wanted to call out Daniels, to challenge him right here, right now. But he knew better. A confrontation in this setting wouldn't change anything. It would only reinforce the perception that he was the problem. That was how this town worked. Instead, he glanced around the diner, his gaze sweeping over the few remaining patrons. None of them were paying attention, but he could feel the tension radiating from the walls. This wasn't a place for people like him, no matter how much his success had been celebrated. This was a place where someone like Officer Daniels could exist comfortably in his skin, a man whose very presence seemed to imply that Malcolm's success, his authority, was somehow out of place here. "Hey, Dr. Ellis." Carla's voice broke through his thoughts, and he looked up to see her standing a little further from the counter, her posture stiff and uncertain. "Can I get you anything else?" He smiled warmly, trying to disarm the quiet unease that lingered in her voice. "No, I'm good, just enjoying the coffee." "Thanks." She nodded quickly and retreated to the kitchen, her shoulders tight. It wasn't hard to imagine what she was thinking. The presence of Officer Daniels in the diner had already shifted the dynamic, and now there was the quiet but insistent pressure to figure out where Malcolm fit in this town's social order. The thought made him uneasy. He didn't need to be the subject of gossip, didn't need to be another problem that needed to be solved. But Elmsford was a town of power, and power wasn't always granted based on merit. It was about perception. It was about image. Minutes passed, and Malcolm sat in silence, staring into his coffee, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. But the moment of peace didn't last long. Officer Daniels moved toward him now, stepping out from behind the counter with a slow, deliberate pace. His boots thudded against the tile, the sound echoing slightly. "Dr. Ellis," Daniels said, his voice cold and formal. "Can I have a word with you?" Malcolm's gaze flicked toward the officer, his muscles tensing. He knew this wasn't going to be just a casual conversation, not with someone like Daniels. The officer's tone was a clear command, not a question, and the subtle undertone of authority that laced his words spoke volumes. It was an unspoken rule in Elmsford. Black men of Malcolm's stature were always questioned, always forced to prove themselves. "Of course," Malcolm said evenly, setting his mug down on the table. He met Daniels's eyes without flinching, choosing to remain calm. "What's this about?" Daniels stood a little straighter, his hands clasped in front of him. "I'm not sure you're aware," he began, his voice taking on that practiced, patronizing cadence that came all too easily to men in positions of power. "But we've been having some issues around here lately with people like you, showing up in places they don't quite belong." Malcolm's heart skipped a beat, and his jaw tightened. He could feel the sting of the words before they were fully spoken. "People like you." It wasn't new, but it always felt like a slap. Even after all these years, he had fought for everything, his education, his career, his success, and yet in this town, it always came back to the same thing. He forced a smile, the kind he had perfected when confronted with people who didn't know how to handle someone like him. "I'm sorry, officer," he said, his voice measured, "but I think you're mistaken. I don't think anyone here has been anything but polite. I'm just trying to enjoy my lunch." Daniels shifted slightly, his gaze flickering toward the window for a brief moment before returning to Malcolm. "Polite doesn't make it right," Daniels said, his voice now tinged with more hostility. "You've got a reputation, Dr. Ellis. A lot of people in this town, they've got questions about how you've managed to rise to the top." Malcolm inhaled sharply, fighting the instinct to snap back. He had heard this before, the insinuations, the doubts, the comments that always seemed to follow him. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he achieved, it was never enough to erase the fact that he was black in a town that couldn't fully accept that reality. "I've worked hard for everything I have, officer," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. "I've built my career on integrity, on doing what's right. I'm not here to start trouble, but I won't let anyone question my worth because of the color of my skin." Daniel's lips twitched, just enough to betray his growing irritation. "You're playing the race card now?" he said, his tone dismissive. "That's funny, coming from someone who's got the world at his feet." Malcolm's fists clenched under the table, the words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. He was no stranger to people who tried to downplay his achievements, to dismiss them, because they didn't fit into their narrow views of who he should be. But this was different. This was a direct challenge, one that Malcolm couldn't afford to ignore. "I'm not playing any card," he said quietly, his voice lowering. "I'm telling you the truth." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the tension so thick it felt like it could snap at any moment. The din of the diner seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the pulse of frustration building in Malcolm's chest. He knew how this would go. He had dealt with this for years, being underestimated, being judged based on assumptions that had nothing to do with his skills, his abilities, or his character. Daniels took a small step closer, his expression now a mixture of condescension and something darker, something almost predatory. "Listen, Dr. Ellis," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "You may have some influence in this town, but you're not above the law, and we've got our ways of dealing with people who think they can push boundaries." Malcolm took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had reached a crossroads, and every instinct in him screamed to stand up, to assert his authority and end this right now. But he knew it wouldn't solve anything, it never did. Fighting fire with fire only got him burned. Instead, he took one final look at Officer Daniels, then at the small diner around them. "If that's how you feel," Malcolm said, his voice controlled, "then I suggest you speak to someone who cares about your threats. I'm not interested in wasting any more of my time here." He stood up, gathering his things slowly, deliberately, his movements deliberate and precise. As he walked out of the diner, his calm composure masked the anger and frustration swirling in his gut. Daniels was just another symptom of a system that wouldn't change easily. But Malcolm knew he couldn't let that system define him. He would take this moment and turn it into something more. The door swung shut behind him, the bell above it jingling softly. The sound was almost soothing, a reminder that he could walk away from this situation even if the system refused to let go of him. But he couldn't ignore the sting. This town would never stop seeing him as an outsider, and as much as he had fought to fit in, he knew, deep down, that Elmsford would always try to remind him where he belonged. Malcolm Ellis knew he was being watched. He had barely stepped out of the diner when a feeling crept over him, one he had grown far too accustomed to. It wasn't just the eyes of Officer Daniels lingering on his back, it was the unspoken network that followed him everywhere, people in power who had their eyes on the prize, but never on him, not truly. His steps quickened as he moved down the street, his gaze fixed ahead. It wasn't fear that made him walk faster, but the creeping realization that this day, this moment, was bigger than just one confrontation. The weight of the eyes on him, the constant judgment that had followed him all his life, was pressing him into a corner. But it wasn't just that. It was the case he had taken on. The one that could expose the rot festering deep within the Elmsford Police Department. He had been fighting for months, gathering evidence and quietly making connections, putting together a case that could change everything. The story of Officer Daniels' involvement in the cover-up of an incident involving police brutality was the one thing that could bring the truth to light. The system in Elmsford had been designed to protect the powerful, but Malcolm had reached a point where he could no longer stand idly by. It wasn't until the heavy rumbling sound of an approaching car pulled him from his thoughts that he realized he had been walking without purpose. A quick glance over his shoulder told him everything he needed to know. The black SUV with tinted windows was following him. His stomach tightened, but his jaw stayed set. He had expected this, anticipated it. He knew that when you moved in certain circles, your enemies weren't always as quiet as you'd like them to be. This wasn't a random coincidence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was retaliation. The SUV pulled to a stop next to him, and the door swung open. Officer Daniels was sitting in the passenger seat, his posture straight, his eyes cold as he watched Malcolm approach. The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. "Dr. Ellis," Daniels said, his voice clipped and full of disdain. "We need to have a conversation." Malcolm didn't hesitate. He walked to the side of the vehicle, stopping just short of the door, his hands slipping into the pockets of his jacket. His mind raced, but his exterior remained calm. He had been here before, cornered, judged, underestimated. But this time, he wasn't about to back down. "I'm not sure what you want to talk about," Malcolm said, his voice cool but firm. "But if this is about the diner, I think you've made your point." Daniel's eyes narrowed. He glanced at the driver of the vehicle, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a dark suit and sunglasses, and then turned back to Malcolm. "You've been stirring up trouble, Dr. Ellis," he said, his voice low. "You've been making some very powerful people uncomfortable, and we don't take kindly to that around here." Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. The implications of Daniel's words hung in the air like smoke. He could feel the coldness of the threat seeping into his bones, but he didn't flinch. "I'm just doing my job," he said evenly. "And I suggest you and your friends remember that." Daniels didn't move, didn't break eye contact. "Your job has consequences. You think you can just waltz into this town and change things? You think you can bring down the police force with your little case and make everything better? That's not how it works, Malcolm. We run this town, and we decide who gets to stay and who gets to go." The words hit Malcolm like a slap in the face, but he didn't let them show. His mind was already racing, calculating. If this was retaliation, it was just the beginning. They wouldn't stop here. They couldn't. "Your corruption is showing, Officer Daniels," Malcolm said, his tone dropping just a little, making it clear that he wasn't intimidated. "And I've been documenting everything. Every lie, every cover-up. You might think you're untouchable, but you're not." For a moment, the air hung still, like a storm that was about to break. Daniels's eyes flashed with anger, his jaw tightening. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the driver spoke up. "Enough, Daniels," the man said, his voice smooth but firm. "Get out of the car, Dr. Ellis, we're taking a drive." Malcolm took a step back, his mind working fast. He had no illusions about what was happening. They weren't going to ask him politely. They weren't even going to give him a chance to say no. This wasn't just a warning anymore, it was a power play. They were going to make him disappear, or at the very least, make him regret challenging the system. But Malcolm wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of fear. He could feel the weight of their expectations on him, but he stood tall, refusing to let them see the cracks in his resolve. "You're not going to intimidate me," Malcolm said, his voice calm but laced with quiet strength. "You can't scare me into silence, you can't keep me from doing what's right." The driver's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't kind. "You think you're special? Just because you wear that suit? You're no different than anyone else in this town, and you'll learn that soon enough." Malcolm didn't move, but he could feel the gravity of the moment pressing down on him. He was no fool. He knew the stakes. This wasn't just about one case anymore. This was about something much bigger. They were showing him their cards, and they weren't playing by the same rules. "Is that a threat?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. The situation was spiraling, and he needed to act fast. "It's a promise," the driver said, his tone dark, before signaling to Daniels to exit the vehicle. Before anything else could happen, a figure stepped into the fray. "Hey, is there a problem here?" The voice was loud, demanding attention. Malcolm turned, his breath catching in his throat, as he saw Mitchell standing just a few feet away. Mitchell was a friend, a local journalist, who had been covering the corruption in Elmsford for years. He was one of the few people who had listened when Malcolm started talking about the police brutality case. One of the few who believed him when he said the system was broken. But Mitchell wasn't just an ally. He was an advocate, someone who had the resources and the drive to help Malcolm expose the truth. The SUV came to a halt, and for a moment, the tension seemed to freeze. The driver glanced at Daniels, and there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But then, the moment passed, and the two men in the vehicle exchanged a look before the driver spoke again. "Get in the car, Dr. Ellis," he ordered, his voice colder now. Mitchell took a step forward, his posture defiant. "Don't do this," he warned, his voice loud enough for the officers to hear. "You've been warned. If you touch him, there will be consequences. I've got everything documented, every conversation, every step you take. Don't make me expose you." Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest, but Mitchell's presence was a lifeline. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy time. Enough to shift the power dynamic, even if it was just for a moment. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You think you can make threats like that and get away with it?" he hissed. But before anyone could move, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. The officers in the SUV exchanged another tense glance, the realization that they might have pushed too far, hanging in the air. But they didn't leave. Instead, the driver shifted the car into gear, the engine growling as he inched closer to Malcolm. "We'll deal with you later, Dr. Ellis," the driver spat. "Enjoy your last few days of freedom." As the SUV slowly pulled away, the sound of the sirens grew louder, and for the first time in a long while, Malcolm felt like the scales had shifted, if only for a moment. But the feeling was fleeting. The war wasn't over. Not yet. He turned to Mitchell, the weight of the situation slowly sinking in. "We need to move fast," Malcolm said quietly, his voice low but urgent. "They're not going to stop, not now." Mitchell nodded, his expression hardening. "We'll take it to the next level. We'll expose them, Malcolm. It's time." The clock was ticking, and Malcolm Ellis knew that his fight had just begun. Malcolm Ellis could feel the pulse of tension in his chest, the beat quickening with every step he took toward the courthouse. He had been here before, but not like this. Not with the weight of everything on his shoulders. The case, the cover-up, the corruption. It had all led to this moment. This wasn't just another day in Elmsford, and he knew it. The whispers of a corrupt police force had spread like wildfire through the town, and the evidence he had gathered had only confirmed what he suspected. Elmsford's power players were tangled in a web of lies, deceit, and intimidation. Officer Daniels was just the tip of the iceberg. Malcolm had been playing a dangerous game. But today, it wasn't just about exposing one man's wrongdoings, it was about bringing down an entire system built on privilege and racism. It was about showing Elmsford the truth, whether it was ready to hear it or not. Mitchell, his loyal ally, was by his side, but even he couldn't mask the tension in the air. There were too many eyes on them, too many people with stakes in the game. And as they approached the courthouse steps, Malcolm could feel the weight of their gazes pressing down on him. Mitchell glanced over at Malcolm, his expression uncertain but determined. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Malcolm nodded, his jaw set firm. "I don't have a choice. It's time they see the truth." The truth. That was what he had been after all along. The truth about the brutality, the cover-ups, and the way Elmsford's power structure had protected its own at the expense of the vulnerable. As he stepped into the courthouse, the noise of the outside world faded, replaced by a cold, sterile silence. The walls of this building were supposed to represent justice, but for years, Malcolm had seen it twist and bend to serve those who had the resources to control it. He had fought for every inch of his career, battling systemic racism and prejudice at every turn. He had put himself at risk every time he spoke up, every time he challenged the status quo. And now, as he made his way to the courtroom, he was prepared for the fight of his life. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. A few familiar faces watched him as he entered, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Among them were members of the local press, some of whom had been reporting on his case for weeks. There were murmurs of surprise and disbelief when they saw him, and Malcolm could almost hear their unspoken questions. What is he doing here? What does he think he can prove? His heels clicked on the marble floors, the sound echoing as he moved through the hall. His heart was steady, but his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He had played by the rules. He had followed the process, the legal channels, the system they had put in place. And yet, here he was, a black man standing alone against the very people who had created those rules. Against the system that had been rigged from the start. The door to the courtroom loomed ahead, and for a moment, Malcolm paused. He wasn't sure what he was about to face. He didn't know if the judge would rule in his favor, or if the jury would even hear the truth he had spent so long collecting. He didn't know if the city would finally have to reckon with its secrets, or if the powerful would simply crush him underfoot, as they had done to so many before him. But then he thought of the people who depended on him, the victims of police brutality, the families torn apart by the system, and the ones who would never have the courage to speak up. His resolve hardened. Malcolm pushed open the door to the courtroom, and immediately, the atmosphere shifted. The chatter died down, the eyes of everyone in the room locking onto him as he entered. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, but this time, he didn't shrink. He walked down the aisle with purpose, his head held high, his posture straight. He was no longer the man who had to prove his worth to anyone. He was a man who had nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. At the bench, Judge Davis looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable. He was an older man, weathered by years of holding power in Elmsford, and though his face remained neutral, Malcolm knew he could feel the weight of the moment. The judge had long been a figurehead of the system, a man who knew how to keep things running smoothly. Until now. Now, the wheels were turning in ways that could no longer be controlled. "Dr. Ellis," Judge Davis said, his voice flat, "I trust you're here to present your evidence?" Malcolm nodded, keeping his voice calm. "Yes, Your Honor. I have the documentation to support the allegations of police brutality and the subsequent cover-up." The room shifted again as Malcolm approached the table where his case files were laid out. He could feel the eyes of the prosecutors, the defense team, and the media on him, but he focused only on the evidence in front of him. He had spent weeks gathering every document, every piece of information that could reveal the truth. But as he began to speak, the interruptions came faster than he could handle. "Objection, Your Honor!" The voice of the defense attorney rang out, sharp and cutting. Malcolm paused, looking toward the defense table. A man in a tailored suit, mid-40s, with a polished face and expensive cufflinks, was standing with a smug look in his eyes. His name was Gregory Hawke, a seasoned attorney who had made a career out of defending the town's elite and corrupt. Hawke was already at the judge's side, his words a blur of legal jargon. "This evidence is irrelevant. It's circumstantial at best. There's no direct proof of wrongdoing." Malcolm's hand tightened around the papers in front of him, but he kept his expression neutral. He had anticipated this. He knew Hawke would do everything in his power to discredit him, but the evidence was irrefutable. The case was solid, and Malcolm wasn't about to let anyone dismiss it. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself," Malcolm said, his voice unwavering. "We have recordings, witness testimonies, and documented evidence that prove Officer Daniels and others within the police force participated in a cover-up of a brutal assault on a civilian. The truth is here." But as Malcolm spoke, he saw the flicker in Judge Davis's eyes. The brief hesitation before he glanced at Hawke with a barely perceptible nod. It was a signal. One that didn't escape Malcolm's notice. The system was shifting, but it wasn't shifting in his favor. Judge Davis slammed his gavel down, silencing the room. "We will recess for the day," he declared, his tone clipped. "Dr. Ellis, we will resume tomorrow. I expect you to be prepared with concrete evidence. This is not a court of speculation." The weight of the judge's words hit Malcolm like a blow to the chest. He could see it now. This wasn't going to be the straightforward case he had hoped for. The system was rigged. This wasn't just about one man's corruption. It was about a system that had learned how to close ranks and protect its own. As the room emptied, Malcolm stood there, still gripping the table, the words of the judge echoing in his mind. He had one chance left, one last opportunity to expose the truth. But it wouldn't come easily. The battle was far from over. "Malcolm?" Mitchell's voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. "You okay?" Malcolm turned to face his friend. The doubt in Mitchell's eyes mirrored his own. They had both known this wasn't going to be easy, but the reality of the fight hit harder now. It was clear the system had already decided its course, and it wasn't going to let Malcolm win without a fight. "I'm fine," Malcolm said, his voice low but steady. "But I need to do something. If I don't act fast, this will all be buried. We have to take this to the next level." Mitchell nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "What are you thinking?" Malcolm's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to wait. He had to make them hear the truth. "We need to go public," Malcolm said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "Tomorrow, when this court reconvenes, I'll make sure everyone knows what's really going on in Elmsford. I won't let them silence me." The courthouse was silent in the aftermath of the day's proceedings, the only sound the faint shuffle of papers and the murmurs of those still lingering. But in the midst of this quiet, Malcolm Ellis felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had walked in hoping to expose the truth, hoping to finally show Elmsford for what it was: corrupt, broken, and discriminatory. But now he stood at the precipice, with the full force of the system arrayed against him. It was all falling apart. As he made his way down the courthouse hallway, his thoughts were consumed by the day's proceedings. Judge Davis had dismissed the case with a flick of his wrist, As if to suggest that Malcolm's evidence wasn't worthy of consideration, Hawke, the defense attorney, had fought tooth and nail to discredit him, spinning lies and creating doubt where there was none. And all the while, Officer Daniels had remained a shadow in the background, watching with cold, calculating eyes. Malcolm knew that this wouldn't be the last time they tried to shut him down. He had expected resistance, but not the sheer extent of it. He had believed, naively perhaps, that the truth would be enough. But now, it was clear that this wasn't just about justice. It was about power. And the people in power weren't about to let anyone tear down the system that had made them untouchable. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and Malcolm turned to see Mitchell approaching, his face a mix of concern and frustration. "Malcolm," Mitchell said, his voice low, "I don't think we can keep going like this. They've got us in a corner." Malcolm met Mitchell's eyes, his jaw clenched tight. He knew what his friend was saying, but it wasn't an option. He couldn't back down now. Not after everything. Not after all the work, the sacrifices he had come too far. "We're not backing down," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "The truth is on our side, and I'm going to make sure it's heard." Mitchell looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "You know what they're capable of, right? If you go any further, they'll come after you hard." Malcolm's gaze hardened. He had already seen what they were capable of. But now, there was something inside him that refused to back down. He had spent too many years being underestimated, too many years being told he didn't belong, but he had earned his place, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. "I'm not afraid," Malcolm said, "but I need to make sure the world knows what's happening here, what's been happening here for years." Mitchell hesitated, but then stepped forward, his voice quieter now. "What's the plan?" Before Malcolm could answer, a sharp voice cut through the air. "You think you can change anything, Dr. Ellis?" The voice was familiar, chilling in its tone. "Officer Daniels." Malcolm froze, his back stiffening. He had known this moment was coming, but the reality of it was different. Officer Daniels stood in front of him, flanked by two other officers in plain clothes. Their eyes were cold, calculating, like they were already preparing for a fight, but this time they were the ones who were going to be surprised. "What is this?" Malcolm asked, his voice low but laced with growing anger. "What do you want?" Daniels smirked, the expression cruel. "I think it's time you learned that not everyone is as eager to see you succeed, Dr. Ellis. Your little case, it's done. You're not going to win this fight, not here, not in this town." Malcolm's fists clenched, but he held his ground. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice gaining strength with every word. "And neither is the truth." Daniels took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Malcolm's face. "You don't get it, do you? You think you're some kind of hero? You think you're going to expose us, tear this whole thing down, but you're just one man, one black man, and you're nothing more than a blip in the system." The words hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut, but he didn't flinch. He could feel the weight of everything bearing down on him, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now. "I've been underestimated my whole life," Malcolm said, his voice quiet but fierce. "You and your kind have been telling me that I don't belong, but I'm here, I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere. You can't silence me." Daniels stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get to talk to me like that, Ellis. You think you can just waltz into our world and make it all better. We built this town, we made it what it is. You don't belong here, you never did." For the first time, Malcolm felt a flicker of something deeper than anger. Something raw, something he had kept buried for years. His hands trembled, but his resolve remained unbroken. The truth had to come out. "I belong here more than you ever will," Malcolm said, his voice steady, each word like a hammer hitting its mark. "I've worked for everything I have. I've built something that means something, and I'm not going to let you destroy it." Daniel's face twisted into a sneer, his lips curling as he took another step forward, towering over Malcolm. "You think your little case is going to change anything? You think you're going to bring me down? You're nothing. You're just a black man with a fancy title. You're nothing but a token, a puppet for the media." The words stung, but Malcolm wasn't going to let them land. He had heard them all before. They didn't mean anything anymore. But just as Daniels moved to take another step toward him, the doors to the courthouse opened and a figure stepped inside. It was the judge, Judge Davis. His expression was stern, his eyes flicking over the scene before him. "What's going on here?" the judge asked, his voice carrying across the room. There was a slight tremor in his voice, but it was quickly masked by the authority he still held. Daniels turned, his demeanor shifting in an instant. "Nothing, Your Honor. Just a little disagreement." Malcolm, his blood boiling, took a step toward the judge. "This man, this system, has been protecting people like Daniels for years. They've been covering up corruption, protecting criminals, and silencing people like me. This town is broken, and you're just letting it happen." Judge Davis's eyes flicked between the two men, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Ellis, I understand your frustration, but you need to watch your words. This is not the place for this kind of argument." Malcolm's chest tightened as he stepped closer to the judge, his voice rising now. "It's exactly the place for it. I've given you the evidence, I've shown you everything. But you've ignored it, dismissed it, like it doesn't matter. You're complicit in all of it." The judge's eyes flickered with something, guilt, perhaps. But before he could speak again, Daniels interjected, "Enough, Ellis. This is over, you've made your point, but you'll learn that people like you don't win around here, not when it matters." For a moment, there was silence, an eerie, tense silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The weight of the conversation, the stakes of the confrontation, hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Daniels pulled something from his jacket pocket, a small piece of paper. "I think it's time you learned your place," Daniels said, holding the paper out in front of him. "You're done. Your career, your case, it's all over." Malcolm's eyes narrowed as he took in the paper. It was a court order, an injunction, a legal tool meant to silence him. His heart raced as he recognized what it was, an attempt to discredit everything he had worked for, to shut him down before the truth could reach the light of day. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about him anymore, this was about everything he had fought for, the future of Elmsford, the future of his community. And he wasn't going to let it slip away without a fight. Malcolm took a deep breath, his resolve solidifying. "You're wrong," he said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. "This isn't over." Daniel smiled coldly. "We'll see about that." The silence in the room was thick, oppressive, as Malcolm stood there, holding his ground. He knew what he had to do. He had to fight back. He had to make them see that the truth would always win, no matter how hard they tried to bury it. But as Daniels and the judge exchanged looks, the weight of their power still loomed large. Malcolm didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing. The fight was just beginning. The heat in the courthouse was suffocating. It wasn't the summer heat, nor the overcrowded room that made it unbearable. It was the palpable tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. For Malcolm Ellis, standing in the center of it all, the pressure felt almost suffocating. This was the culmination of everything he had been fighting for, everything he had risked. Every day, every step, had led him here, and now, here he was, on the verge of losing it all. As the judge banged his gavel, signaling the final recess, Malcolm stood motionless at the center of the courtroom. His hands were clenched tightly at his sides, a quiet storm building inside him. Officer Daniels had just played his final card, the paper in his hand, a legal injunction, meant to silence Malcolm and bury the case. It wasn't just about the police brutality anymore. It wasn't just about the corrupt officers hiding behind a thin veil of legality. This was about power, about a system built to protect those at the top, to preserve the status quo, no matter the cost. Malcolm could feel the walls closing in. They thought he would back down. They thought they could intimidate him into silence, but that was before they knew who he truly was. "Malcolm," Mitchell's voice broke through his thoughts, low and urgent. "You can't let them get away with this. This isn't just about your career anymore. This is everything." Malcolm turned to his friend, his mind racing. The injunction, the courtroom, the judge. They were all pieces in a game he didn't want to play anymore, but he wasn't going to lose. Not like this. Not to them. "They think they've won," Malcolm said, his voice steady, though the anger boiled just below the surface. "But I'm not done. Not yet." Mitchell's gaze flickered toward the back of the courtroom, where Daniels was standing, flanked by two other officers, his smirk ever present. The defense team was packing up, already celebrating what they thought was a victory. But Malcolm knew something they didn't. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. "We need to take this to the next level," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "I'm going to make them regret this. I'm going to expose them all." Mitchell hesitated. "What's the plan?" Malcolm's eyes narrowed as he looked back at the officers, his resolve hardening. "I'm going to force their hand. I'll show the world who they really are." The tension outside the courthouse had grown unbearable as well. Malcolm and Mitchell walked in silence toward the street, the echo of their footsteps, the only sound breaking through the oppressive quiet. The weight of the injunction was heavy in Malcolm's pocket, but it was the least of his worries. He had something else, something bigger, something far more dangerous to them than any legal document could be. Mitchell's hand found his shoulder, a steadying touch, but even that couldn't erase the doubt creeping in. "You sure about this? If you're going public with it, they won't let this go. You'll be marked, they'll come after you." Malcolm stopped walking, turning to face his friend. The seriousness of Mitchell's words hit harder than he wanted to admit. He knew the consequences. He knew how far the system would go to protect its own. But his mind was made up. "I didn't come this far to stop now," Malcolm said. His voice was calm but resolute. "I've been silenced my whole life. They're not going to silence me anymore." Just then, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, the engine rumbling quietly beneath the street noise. Officer Daniels stepped out of the back seat, flanked by another officer, both wearing the same smug expression. "Dr. Ellis," Daniels said, his voice mocking, "I think you're about to learn how the game really works." Malcolm turned to face him, his eyes steady and unflinching. "I've already learned everything I need to know about you, Daniels. You don't scare me." The officer's grin widened, but there was a coldness behind it. "Oh, I think you'll find that you're the one who's going to be scared. I suggest you back off. You're making things harder on yourself." Malcolm stepped forward, his stance unshaken. "You don't get to tell me what to do anymore. You think you're in control, but you're not. You've been lying, hiding behind your badge, but the truth is coming, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." For a moment, Daniels said nothing, his eyes flickering with barely contained anger. Then, with a sharp gesture, he motioned to the other officer. "Take him," Daniels ordered. "We're not going to let him make this harder on everyone. It's time for him to understand his place." But before the officers could close in, Malcolm was ready. He wasn't going to let them walk all over him anymore. He had prepared for this moment, had thought about it for days. As the officer lunged toward him, Malcolm sidestepped with a calculated ease, using the officer's momentum against him. The man crashed into the side of the car with a grunt, momentarily stunned. Malcolm didn't waste a second. He moved toward Daniels, eyes locked on him. He had been pushed to his limit, but now, in this moment, he felt more powerful than ever before. He had nothing left to lose. Daniels backed away, his earlier arrogance replaced with a hint of uncertainty. "You think you can take us all on?" he spat, his voice venomous. "You'll regret this." Malcolm's eyes never wavered. "I've been fighting my entire life for respect for equality. I've fought harder than any of you ever will." Just then, a flash of movement caught his eye. It was Mitchell, pulling out his phone, capturing the scene, the evidence. He wasn't going to let them cover this up. Malcolm had made up his mind. The world would see the truth. "You think you can intimidate me with your threats, Daniels?" Malcolm asked, his voice low and steady. "I'm not afraid of you or anyone else in this town." Daniels looked at him, fury boiling beneath his cold exterior. "You don't understand. You think you're the hero in some story, but in reality, you're nothing more than a pawn. This isn't your town. You never belonged here." Malcolm's jaw tightened. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about the deep-rooted prejudice that ran through this town like an unspoken rule. Daniels wasn't just protecting the corrupt system. He was trying to erase Malcolm's place in it, trying to make him feel like he didn't deserve to be here. That his presence, his achievements, were somehow wrong. "You're wrong," Malcolm said, stepping closer. "I've earned my place, and no matter how much you try to push me down, I'll stand tall, because the truth doesn't bend to your rules." At that moment, the car door opened, and a new figure emerged, a familiar face. It was Judge Davis, the very man who had dismissed his case earlier. He walked toward the scene, his expression tight, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. Malcolm knew the judge had been caught in the system's grasp. But it was clear now. This wasn't just about one man's corruption. It was about an entire town. An entire system. Built on lies. "Enough," Judge Davis said, his voice shaking with authority. "This isn't how we handle things." Malcolm didn't back down. "No, this is exactly how we handle things. It's time the truth came out, and you can't stop it." The judge's eyes flickered between Malcolm and Daniels. There was a moment of hesitation, and in that brief instant, Malcolm saw it. The truth. The judge was part of it. He wasn't just a bystander, he was complicit in all of it. The corruption wasn't just in the police force, it was in the very foundation of the system that governed Elmsford. "You've all been hiding behind your titles," Malcolm said, his voice rising, filling the space. "But I'm not going to let you hide anymore. The people will know what you've been doing, they'll know what you've been trying to protect." The tension in the air was unbearable. Every word Malcolm spoke seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. The system, the people who had thought themselves untouchable, were starting to feel the weight of the truth. And in that moment, Malcolm realized something. It wasn't just about winning the case. It wasn't just about exposing the corruption. It was about changing the narrative, about making sure that the voices of those who had been silenced were heard. And no matter what happened, no matter the cost, he wouldn't stop. But just as he finished speaking, Daniels stepped forward, his hand reaching for his radio. The officers around them seemed to close in, their movements slow, deliberate. The confrontation wasn't over, and in that instant, everything felt like it was teetering on the edge of something irreversible. Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment. This was his stand. The tension in the air was thick as Officer Daniels moved to grab his radio, his hand hovering for a moment before making contact. The words he muttered were barely audible, but Malcolm could hear the urgency in them. They were calling for backup, probably hoping to silence him before this moment could spread beyond the courthouse. But for once, the system they relied on wasn't going to protect them. The noise of sirens began to wail in the distance, echoing down the street, but it wasn't the sound Malcolm was waiting for. His ally, Mitchell, had already begun working the phones. He had reached out to the press, to local activists, to anyone who would listen. This wasn't just about one man standing up against a corrupt system anymore. This was about a movement, a chance to shine a light on everything that had been swept under the rug for far too long. The officers surrounding him paused, their eyes flicking nervously as they heard the sirens approach. The reality of the situation was starting to dawn on them. No matter how hard they tried, the truth was coming for them. They couldn't silence Malcolm anymore. He had made sure of that. Before Daniels could make another move, a new figure emerged from the crowd, the police chief, a woman named Carla Jackson, who had been an unofficial ally for years. Her reputation had been one of caution, someone who kept her head down and worked within the system. But now, her expression was grim, and as she approached, she locked eyes with Daniels. "This is over, Daniels," Chief Jackson said, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. "You've gone too far this time." Daniels' eyes widened, the smirk that had been on his face since the moment he walked up to Malcolm slipping away. "What are you talking about?" he hissed, taking a step back, his posture defensive. Chief Jackson stepped closer, her hands clasped behind her back. "I've been watching this whole thing, the cover-ups, the lies I knew about the assault you tried to bury, but you pushed too far this time, and now you're going to pay for it." The weight of her words hung in the air like a bomb, and for a moment, Daniels seemed to lose all sense of control. His eyes darted to the other officers standing nearby, but none of them moved. The tide had shifted. "You're making a huge mistake, Carla," Daniels said, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't take me down. You're just one person, this whole town is on our side." "Not anymore," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Malcolm's right. The truth doesn't bend to your rules. We've had enough." The sirens grew louder as a small group of reporters approached, led by a familiar face, Jordan Thomas, a local journalist known for her investigative work. She had been one of the first to cover Malcolm's case, and now, her camera was trained on Daniels, capturing every tense moment. "Is this the moment you've been waiting for, Officer Daniels?" Jordan's voice rang out, her camera clicking furiously. "Do you have anything to say to the people of Elmsford, because it looks like your time in this town is coming to an end?" Daniels looked at her with pure hatred, but his mouth went dry. He knew this was it, the moment his power crumbled. He glanced at Chief Jackson one last time, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. Without another word, he turned and stormed off, his footsteps heavy with defeat. The other officers stood frozen, not daring to follow him. Malcolm's chest tightened as he watched Daniels disappear into the distance. It wasn't the end he had expected, but it was the one he needed. The system had cracked, and the man who had held the reins of corruption for so long was gone. The crowd that had gathered outside the courthouse began to stir. The reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens who had come to witness the confrontation were now buzzing with excitement. Malcolm felt a hand on his shoulder, and he turned to find Mitchell standing beside him, his face a mixture of disbelief and pride. "You did it, Malcolm," Mitchell said quietly. "You really did it." Malcolm smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of exhaustion. "We did it. All of us. This wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who's been silenced for far too long." Chief Jackson turned to face them both, her expression softening. "I wasn't sure I could do this. I've been part of the system for so long, and I didn't think there was any way to change it, but you forced my hand. You made me see that it wasn't about playing by their rules, it was about doing what was right." Malcolm nodded, the weight of the moment settling in. "The system's broken, but we're fixing it one step at a time." Jordan Thomas approached, her camera still hanging from her neck. She extended her hand to Malcolm. "You gave us the story we've been waiting for. I can't even imagine the pressure you've been under, but you stood firm, and now, the whole world will know what's been happening in Elmsford." Malcolm shook her hand, his eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered to witness the moment. There was a shift in the air now, something tangible. The feeling that they were on the cusp of something bigger. Something better. The next few weeks passed in a blur. The story broke wide, and soon the news of Officer Daniels's corruption was spread across local and national outlets. The community of Elmsford, once divided by silence, was now united in its fight for justice. Protests erupted, the people of the town demanding accountability for the years of oppression, discrimination, and abuse of power. The tide of public opinion had shifted irreparably, and there was no going back. Chief Jackson was placed under internal review, but there was little doubt that her actions would have long-lasting consequences. The weight of her choice had torn down the walls that had kept Elmsford's corruption hidden, and though her career was uncertain, she had redeemed herself in the eyes of many. The people knew that things couldn't go back to the way they were. The question now was how much the town was willing to change. Malcolm had become a figurehead in the movement. He had been prepared for the fallout, but the support he received was overwhelming. His name was no longer just tied to the medical field or his title as CEO. It was now a symbol of resistance, of resilience. But he hadn't expected the kind of personal toll the fight would take. Every day brought new challenges. The press followed him everywhere. His phone rang constantly with calls from politicians, activists, and media outlets. But amidst it all, he found moments of peace. He had always been driven, but now he was driven by something else. Something deeper. One afternoon, as he walked through the bustling streets of Elmsford, a voice called out to him. It was a woman he didn't recognize, but her face was warm with familiarity. "You don't know me, Dr. Ellis," she said, her eyes bright. "But I wanted to thank you. You've inspired my son. He's been so angry for so long, but now he's out there fighting for the truth. You gave him hope. You gave us hope." Malcolm smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile. "I'm glad I could help, but the work isn't over. We've only just begun." As the weeks turned into months, Malcolm continued to fight, using his position to push for systemic change. He worked alongside local organizations, lawmakers, and citizens to draft new policies, ensuring that the abuses of the past would never be repeated. But he knew that real change wasn't just about laws, it was about changing hearts and minds. And while there were still many battles ahead, Malcolm felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt before. The fight for justice was far from over, but he had taken the first step, and that was enough to keep him going. The story ends on a note of hope, but the road ahead is still uncertain. Malcolm's victory over Daniels and the corrupt system was significant, but it was just one chapter in a long struggle for justice and equality. The ripple effect of his actions had already begun to change Elmsford, and as he looked toward the future, he knew that the fight would continue. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome, but he had already proven that he had the strength to face them. As he walked down the street, the wind brushing past him, he knew one thing for sure. He would never stop fighting for what was right. Not now, not ever.